The island of Saipan, June 19, 1944. Beneath a canopy of tropical palms, dozens of Japanese women huddled in a cave, their faces streaked with dust and tears, their civilian clothes torn and filthy from weeks of surviving in the island's limestone caverns. Outside, the sounds of distant artillery had finally stopped after 25 days of relentless conflict. They believed with absolute certainty that their final hours had arrived. Everything they had been told about the enemy assured them that capture would bring unspeakable horror. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these women were about to discover would shatter every assumption they held, delivered by the last people their government had taught them to fear, and their question to their captors would reveal just how deeply propaganda had poisoned their understanding of the world beyond their shores. Reiko Tanaka pressed herself against the cool limestone wall of the cave, her 6-year-old daughter Fumiko trembling in her arms. Around them, 43 other women and children whispered prayers or sat in stunned silence. The darkness was broken only by thin shafts of tropical sunlight filtering through the cave entrance, illuminating particles of dust that drifted like snow in the still air. Reiko could smell the salt from the ocean mixing with the earthy scent of the cave and the acrid odor of fear that permeated the space. It had been 25 days since the conflict began transforming their peaceful island home into what American military planners designated as Operation Forager. Reiko had been a schoolteacher in Garapan, the island's main town, married to Hiroshi, a civilian administrator who worked at the sugar refinery. Her life had been ordinary, filled with lesson plans and evening meals, children's laughter and community festivals. That world had vanished the morning of June 15th, when the horizon filled with more ships than she had ever imagined could exist in one place. She remembered her husband's face that morning, the way his hands had trembled as he helped her pack what they could carry. The local military authorities had gathered the civilian population, separating the men from the women and children. Hiroshi had pressed a small photograph into her hands, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Whatever happens, protect Fumiko. The Americans are monsters, but you must survive. Japan will come for us. The Emperor will not abandon his people." That had been the last time Reiko saw him. The military officials had moved the men to positions they said would help defend the island. The women and children had been directed to the caves in the island's interior, told to wait for the glorious Japanese forces to repel the invasion. Instead, they had spent more than 3 weeks listening to the sounds of their world being torn apart, venturing out only at night to scavenge for food and water from the increasingly devastated landscape. The cave had become their entire universe, a dark womb where time lost meaning and fear became the only constant. During the daylight hours, they could hear the mechanical thunder of vehicles moving across the island, the sharp crack of gunfire, the deeper boom of artillery. At night, the sounds continued, but changed character, becoming more sporadic, punctuated by long silences that somehow felt more terrifying than the noise. In those silences, the women would creep out to search for food, moving like ghosts through a landscape, transformed into something unrecognizable. 19-year-old Ayako Matsumoto sat near the cave entrance, her role as one of the younger women making her a reluctant lookout. She had been engaged to be married before the conflict came. Her fiancé Kenji, a promising young officer in the garrison, he had given her explicit instructions before reporting to his post. "If the enemy comes, if capture is certain, you know what honor demands. I have left you the means." He had pressed a small blade into her hands, its edge sharp enough for the terrible purpose it might serve. Ayako still carried that blade, wrapped in a piece of silk tucked into her belt. She had watched several women already make the choice Kenji had described, unable to face what they believed awaited them. The memory of their final moments haunted her, but she understood. The propaganda broadcasts they had heard for years, the lectures from military officials, the stories spread through their community, all painted the same picture of American forces as barbaric savages who would show no mercy, particularly to women. The propaganda had been systematic and relentless. From the moment tensions with America had escalated, The government-controlled media had presented a carefully crafted narrative of American depravity and Japanese superiority. Radio broadcasts described atrocities that Americans had supposedly committed in other theaters, stories that mixed truth with fiction in ways designed to terrify. Schools had incorporated these messages into curricula, teaching children that their racial purity made them superior, that Americans were mongrel barbarians who lacked true civilization. Among the group was 67-year-old Grandmother Sato, the eldest among them, and a woman whose presence provided a thin thread of stability to the terrified group. She had lived through the transformation of Saipan from a remote island into a crucial outpost, had seen the massive military build-up, the arrival of thousands of soldiers, the construction of defensive positions. She had believed, like everyone, in the invincibility of their forces. The reality of the past weeks had shaken that faith, but she clung to dignity with the determination of someone who had survived many hardships. Grandmother Sato had been born in 1877, had lived through the Meiji Restoration, had seen Japan transform from a feudal society into a modern industrial power. She had watched as traditional values merged with nationalist fervor, as the concept of dying for the emperor became sacred doctrine. Her own husband had served in the conflict with Russia in 1905, returning home with medals and stories of glory that shaped her understanding of military service and national duty. She moved through the cave now, checking on the children, offering words of comfort to the mothers, rationing their dwindling supplies of rice and water with careful precision. They had perhaps 2 more days of food remaining, if they were disciplined. The water situation was more critical. The small stream they had been using at night had been contaminated 3 days ago, possibly by chemicals from the conflict or simply by the bodies that now littered the island. Several children had already fallen ill from drinking water that was not clean, their small bodies racked with fever and stomach pains that the women had no medicine to treat. "They will be here soon," whispered Michiko Yamada, a mother of 3 whose husband had been a merchant before being conscripted into labor service. "I can hear vehicles. The sounds are getting closer." The women fell silent, straining to hear. Through the cave entrance, the mechanical rumble of engines became audible, along with voices speaking in a language that sent ice through their veins. English, the language of the enemy. The sound of it was both abstract and terrifying, representing everything they had been taught to fear, every horror they had been promised would befall them if captured. Reiko's grip on Fumiko tightened. Her daughter looked up at her with eyes that trusted her mother to protect her from anything. How could she explain to a 6-year-old what might happen next? The stories they had been told were too terrible to speak aloud. Tales of atrocities that military officials had assured them were the fate of anyone captured by American forces. Tales of women dishonored, children taken away, families destroyed. Whether these stories were true or fabricated mattered less than the fact that everyone believed them absolutely. The vehicles stopped somewhere near the cave entrance. Boots crunched on coral and limestone. More voices calling out in English, the words incomprehensible, but the tone suggesting they were searching for something or someone. The women drew closer together, mothers clutching children, younger women gripping whatever makeshift weapons or implements they had managed to acquire. Some had nothing more than sharp stones or broken pieces of bamboo. Others, like Ayako, had the blades their men had provided for a darker purpose. Then a voice called out in broken but understandable Japanese, "Please come out. You are safe. We have water, food, medicine. Children need help. Please come out." The accent was strange, the grammar imperfect, but the message was clear. The women looked at each other in confusion and continued fear. Was this a trick? Were the Americans trying to lure them out for some cruel purpose? Or could it possibly be true that they would be treated with basic humanity? Grandmother Sato rose slowly, her aged joints protesting. "Someone must look," she said quietly. "Someone must see if this is a trick or if there is truth in these words. We cannot hide here forever. The children need water, they need food, we must know." Reiko found herself standing, though she could not remember making the decision to do so. "I will go," she heard herself say. "If it is a trap, better one than all of us. If it is not, I can signal the others." She moved toward the cave entrance, her legs unsteady, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Each step felt like walking toward her execution, yet something deeper drove her forward. Perhaps it was the maternal instinct to protect Fumiko, the understanding that they could not survive much longer in the cave. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, a breaking point where even the worst feared outcome seemed preferable to the slow starvation and dehydration they faced. Or perhaps it was a tiny seed of doubt about everything she had been told, a whisper of hope that the propaganda might not be entirely true. The sunlight beyond the cave was blinding after the darkness, and she raised a hand to shield her eyes as she stepped out into the heat of the afternoon. The tropical air hit her like a wall, thick and humid, carrying scents of the ocean and vegetation, but also the underlying smell of destruction that permeated the island. For a moment she could see nothing but white light and shadow, then her eyes adjusted, and what she saw stopped her completely. A group of soldiers stood in a rough semicircle around the cave entrance, their uniforms identifying them as American forces. But these were not the monsters she had been taught to expect. They were black men, African-American soldiers, and they stood with their weapons pointed at the ground, their postures non-threatening. Their faces showed concern rather than hostility, weariness rather than aggression. One of them, who appeared to be in charge based on the markings on his uniform, stepped forward slowly, his hands raised to show they were empty. "My name is Sergeant James Washington," he said in that same broken Japanese. "We mean no harm. Please let us help." Reiko stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. In all the propaganda, in all the warnings, no one had mentioned that some American soldiers would look like this. The racial theories she had been fed, the hierarchy of peoples her government had preached, crashed against the reality of this man standing before her, with concern evident in his eyes. She had been taught that Americans were all white devils, had never been told that America itself was a nation of many races, that among its forces were men whose own histories were marked by oppression and struggle. Sergeant James Washington was 32 years old, originally from a small town outside Athens, Georgia, a man who had spent his entire life navigating the complex and often brutal realities of being black in America. He had grown up picking cotton on land his family sharecropped, had attended a colored school where textbooks were cast-offs from white schools, had learned young that his skin color would limit his opportunities in ways that had nothing to do with his abilities or character. He had joined the army in 1942, part of the expansion of African-American units that military necessity had forced upon a still segregated military establishment. He had trained with the 93rd Infantry Division at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, enduring not just the rigors of combat preparation, but the indignities of a system that still treated him as a second-class citizen, even as it demanded he risk his life for his country. The training had been harsh, designed to prove that black soldiers could meet the same standards as white soldiers, though the underlying assumption that such proof was necessary stung deeply. His unit had landed on Saipan on June 22nd, 7 days into the operation. Assigned primarily to support and garrison duties rather than frontline combat roles, a reflection of the military's persistent doubts about African-American soldiers, despite their proven capabilities in previous conflicts. Washington had seen enough of conflict in the past weeks to know its true face, had witnessed enough suffering to understand that the people huddled in these caves were victims, not enemies. He had watched the destruction of civilian areas, had seen the bodies of women and children caught in crossfire or driven to desperate ends by fear and propaganda. Behind Washington stood 7 other members of his squad, each with their own story of perseverance through a system designed to limit them. Corporal Marcus Thompson from Chicago, whose grandfather had been born into slavery and whose father had migrated north during the Great Migration, seeking opportunities that the South denied. Private First Class David Johnson from Harlem, who had been a talented jazz musician before the conflict, playing in the clubs where black culture flourished despite the restrictions imposed by white society. Private Robert Lee from Mississippi, whose name carried a bitter irony given his Southern origins and the Confederate general it inadvertently honored. Each of them had joined a fight for freedom abroad while still denied full freedom at home, a contradiction that weighed on them differently but which they all felt acutely. They had been warned by their white officers about the Japanese civilian population, told that they might encounter resistance, that propaganda had poisoned the minds of the islanders against all Americans. What their officers had not anticipated was how the presence of black soldiers might confound those very propaganda narratives. The Japanese had been taught to fear and hate white Americans specifically, their propaganda built around racial theories that emphasized conflict between Asian and European peoples. The presence of African American soldiers introduced a complexity that the propaganda had not addressed, creating a moment of cognitive dissonance that might allow for different outcomes. Washington took another step forward, moving slowly, as one might approach a frightened animal. He could see the woman's confusion clearly written on her face, her fear warring with something else, perhaps curiosity, or the desperate hope that her situation might not be as dire as she had believed. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the eyes of people back home when he had defied their expectations, when he had proven himself capable despite their prejudices, when he had forced them to reconsider their assumptions about what a black man could achieve. "Please," he said again, his limited Japanese vocabulary stretched to its limits. "Children sick? We have doctor. We have food, clean water. Please let us help. No one will hurt you. I promise this on my honor." Reiko found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" The question encompassed everything, her confusion and fear and desperate need to understand what was happening. The question seemed to hang in the humid air between them. Washington glanced back at his squad, then returned his attention to the woman before him. Through gestures and the few Japanese words he knew, combined with the universal language of compassion that transcended words, he tried to explain. "Because it is right thing to do," he said simply. "Because children should not suffer for conflict they did not choose. Because you are people, not enemy. People need help." From inside the cave, other women had gathered at the entrance, drawn by the sound of conversation instead of violence, by the lack of screaming or gunfire, by the simple fact that Reiko still stood there alive and apparently unharmed. Grandmother Sato emerged, her dignity intact despite her disheveled appearance, her weathered face showing the accumulated wisdom of 67 years of life. She studied the soldiers before her, with eyes that had seen much in her long life, eyes that could read character in a person's bearing and expression. Then she asked the question that would echo through the decades that followed, the question that exposed the depth of the lies they had been fed, the question that Washington would remember for the rest of his life. "Are you here to punish us?" The words were clear, spoken in Japanese that Washington understood even with his limited grasp of the language, because the tone and context made the meaning unmistakable. He felt the question like a physical blow, understanding in that moment just how thoroughly these women had been deceived about what capture would mean, how completely the propaganda had convinced them that Americans would be vengeful and cruel. Washington removed his helmet, a gesture of respect, and looked directly at Grandmother Sato. "No, ma'am," he said, reverting to the English his squad would understand while gesturing in a way he hoped would convey his meaning. Corporal Thompson, who had a better command of Japanese picked up from working with a Nisei translator they had been assigned earlier in the campaign, stepped forward to translate more accurately. "We are not here to punish anyone." Thompson translated Washington's words carefully. "We are here to help, to protect, to get you somewhere safe where children can eat, where sick can be treated, where you can rest without fear. We do not make conflict against women and children. This is not our way." Grandmother Sato's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion beyond stoic endurance that Reiko had seen from the older woman in weeks. "But they told us," Sato said, her voice breaking with the weight of realization. "They told us what would happen. They told us that Americans were devils, that capture meant worse than death, especially for women. They told us we must choose honor over the shame of falling into enemy hands." Thompson translated her words for Washington, whose jaw tightened with anger, not at the woman before him but at the system that had filled her head with such horror. He had fought his entire life against people who had deemed him less than human because of his skin color, had endured degradation and limitation and injustice. He recognized the poison of dehumanization when he saw it, understood how it was used to justify any cruelty, any sacrifice. The same mechanisms that white supremacists used to rationalize discrimination against black Americans had been employed by Japanese militarists to prepare their people for total sacrifice. "Ma'am," Washington said, and Thompson carefully translated, "I do not know what you were told, but I can tell you what is true. We have been ordered to protect civilians, to treat them with respect, to help them survive this terrible time. There are field hospitals set up where doctors treat anyone who needs care. There are food distribution centers where families can receive rations. There are places where families can stay safely while this island recovers from conflict. The fighting here is ending. The suffering does not have to continue." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued with words that came from deep conviction. "I will be honest with you. Where I come from, in my own country, I am not always treated with respect. Because of my skin, some people think I am less than them. I have been called names you would not want to hear. I have been denied opportunities, treated as inferior, judged before I ever opened my mouth. The law itself has said I am not equal, but I still believe in doing what is right. I still believe in treating people with dignity, and I will not let anyone, enemy or friend, suffer if I can prevent it. This I promise you." Thompson translated carefully, conveying not just the words but the emotion behind them, the sincerity that rang in Washington's voice. Sato studied Washington's face for a long moment, seeing past the uniform to the man beneath, recognizing in his bearing the same dignity she tried to maintain in her own life. Then she reached out with a weathered hand and placed it on his arm, a gesture that crossed all barriers of language and culture. "You are a good man," she said simply. "Whatever others may say, whatever prejudice you face, I see what is in your heart. Thank you for proving the lies wrong. Thank you for showing us that humanity exists even in this terrible time." Private Johnson moved forward slowly, his canteen extended toward the cave entrance where small faces peered out with a mixture of fear and desperate thirst. "For the children," he said, not needing translation. "Water, clean, safe." He unscrewed the canteen and took a drink himself before offering it again, a gesture of trust that showed it was not poisoned, not contaminated, simply water given freely to those who needed it. A gesture that said more than any words could about his intentions. Ayako, who had emerged from the cave still clutching her hidden blade, watched as Johnson unscrewed the canteen and demonstrated its safety. She had been prepared to use that blade on herself if necessary, convinced that death would be preferable to what she had been told awaited her. Now she watched an American soldier offering water to Japanese children with no apparent ulterior motive, and something inside her began to crack. Her hand released the blade, letting it fall back into her belt, no longer the tool of desperate escape she had thought she would need. One of the children, a small boy of perhaps 4 years old, broke away from his mother and moved toward Johnson with the unpredictable courage of the very young, drawn by the promise of water in a way that overcame his fear. "Water," the child said in Japanese, pointing at the canteen with a grubby finger, his voice thin with dehydration. Johnson knelt down, bringing himself to the child's level rather than looming over him, and handed over the canteen with gentle hands. The boy drank deeply, water spilling down his chin and onto his dirty shirt, and then his mother was there, bowing repeatedly, tears streaming down her face as she tried to express gratitude in a language Johnson did not speak, but understood perfectly in the universal language of a parent's relief at seeing their child's needs met. That single moment broke the dam of fear that had held the women paralyzed. Other children emerged from the cave, drawn by the sight of water, their small voices calling out in Japanese as they overcame their learned fear in favor of their immediate needs. Behind them came their mothers, their grandmothers, their sisters, their aunts. 43 women and children, filthy and exhausted and terrified, stepping out into the sunlight to face the enemy they had been taught to fear more than death itself. Washington's squad moved into action with practiced efficiency, but also with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even themselves. They distributed water from their canteens, broke out their emergency rations to share with hungry children who had not eaten properly in days, called on the radio for medical support and additional supplies. Private Lee, who had worked as a farmhand in Mississippi before the conflict and had a way with children from helping raise his younger siblings, somehow produced small pieces of hard candy from his pack and offered them to the children who had begun to gather around the soldiers with increasing confidence. Little Fumiko received one of these candies, taking it with wide eyes and a shy smile that transformed her dirty, frightened face into something resembling the child she should have been. She looked up at her mother for permission, and Reiko, still processing the surreal turn of events, nodded her consent. Fumiko unwrapped the candy with careful fingers and placed it in her mouth, her eyes widening at the sweetness she had not tasted in so long. Reiko watched it all with a sense of unreality, as though she had stepped through some portal into an alternate world where everything she knew was inverted. These men, whom her government had taught her to hate and fear above all others, were showing her daughter kindness. They were sharing their own food and water, precious resources in a conflict zone, were calling for medical help, were treating them not as enemies or inferior beings, but as human beings in need of assistance. The contrast between what she had been promised and what she was experiencing was so vast that her mind struggled to reconcile the two realities. A medical corpsman arrived within 20 minutes, having been radioed about the situation. He was a white officer named Lieutenant Richard Patterson from somewhere in New England, and he took one look at the sick children and immediately began setting up a treatment area with focused professionalism. He worked alongside the black soldiers without apparent concern for the racial hierarchies that Reiko would later learn permeated American society, focused entirely on the medical needs before him. His hands were gentle as he examined the children, checking for dehydration and illness, his voice calm as he gave instructions through Thompson's translation about what treatments he would provide. As Patterson examined the children, checking their pulses and looking at their eyes and asking questions about their symptoms through Thompson's translation, Washington sat down near Grandmother Sato on a flat rock that provided a seat. Using Thompson to bridge the language gap, he began a conversation that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives, a conversation that went beyond immediate practicalities to touch on deeper questions of humanity and propaganda. "I need to understand," Washington said, his voice gentle but intent. "What exactly were you told would happen if you were captured? I need to know this so we can help others who might still be hiding, who might be making terrible choices based on false information." Sato hesitated, clearly struggling with whether to speak of such things, but then she seemed to decide that truth was owed to this man who had shown them such unexpected kindness. Thompson translated her words carefully as she spoke. "We were told that American soldiers would show no mercy," she began, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject, "that women would be violated and dishonored in ways too terrible to speak of clearly, that children would be taken away from their mothers or harmed for sport, that our suffering would be deliberate and cruel because Americans viewed us as less than human, as inferior beings deserving only of contempt. We were told it was better to choose death than to face such a fate. Many believed this absolutely. Many chose accordingly, taking their own lives or those of their children to avoid what they believed awaited them." She paused, tears now flowing freely down her weathered cheeks as the full weight of those lost lives settled on her. "I watched women I had known my entire life make that choice. I watched mothers do unthinkable things to their own children because they believed it was an act of love and protection. And I understood their reasoning because I believed the same lies. If you had come even one day later, I might have made that choice myself. We all might have." Thompson's voice was heavy as he translated her words into English for the benefit of Washington and the rest of the squad, and several of the soldiers looked away, their faces showing the impact of hearing such terrible revelations. Washington closed his eyes briefly, the weight of those words settling on him like a physical burden. How many had made that terrible choice because of lies? How many lives had been lost, not to the conflict itself, but to the poison of propaganda that had convinced people that death was preferable to capture? "I am so sorry," Washington said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Sorry that you were lied to in such a cruel way. Sorry for what you have endured because of those lies. Sorry that anyone convinced you that we were monsters, when all most of us want is for this conflict to end, so everyone can go home to their families." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, wanting her to understand something important. I will be honest with you, ma'am, more honest than perhaps I should be. Where I come from, in my own country, I am not always treated with respect or equality. Because of my skin, because of the color that you can see, many people think I am less than them. I have been called terrible names. I have been denied opportunities that were freely given to white men with less ability than me. I have been treated as inferior, judged before I ever opened my mouth or demonstrated my capabilities. The law itself, in many places, says I am not equal, that I must use separate facilities, live in separate neighborhoods, accept limitations that others do not face. Thompson translated carefully, and the women listening could see the pain behind Washington's words, the lived experience of discrimination and injustice that informed his perspective. He continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke his truth. But despite all of that, I still believe in doing what is right. I still believe in treating people with dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from. I still believe that every person deserves basic human compassion, and I will not let anyone, enemy or friend, ally or opponent, suffer if I can prevent it. This I promise you, not as a soldier following orders, but as a man who knows what it is to be dehumanized and who refuses to perpetuate that evil against others. There was a long silence after Thompson finished translating, broken only by the sounds of children drinking water and Patterson working with his medical supplies. Then Sato reached out again and placed both of her weathered hands on Washington's larger ones, looking directly into his eyes with the intensity of someone sharing a profound truth. "Sergeant Washington," she said through Thompson's translation, "you are a truly good man. Whatever prejudice you face in your own country, whatever limitations others try to impose on you, I see the quality of your character and the strength of your spirit. You have shown us that propaganda is a terrible weapon, perhaps worse than any explosive or bullet, because it kills the possibility of understanding and compassion. You have given us back our lives, but more than that, you have given us back our faith in human goodness. We will never forget this. I will never forget you." Over the next several hours, Washington's squad coordinated the evacuation of the women and children to a civilian internment camp that had been established near the southern end of the island. The journey involved careful navigation through terrain that was still being cleared of unexploded ordnance and debris from the recent fighting. The soldiers walked slowly, accommodating the pace of exhausted women and small children, offering arms to lean on, and carrying the youngest ones who could not walk the full distance. The camp itself was a revelation to the Japanese civilians, a stark contrast to everything they had been told to expect. It was a place with medical facilities staffed by doctors and nurses, regular food distribution points where rations were provided without cruelty or mockery, and living quarters that, while far from luxurious and certainly not equivalent to their lost homes, were humane and safe. There were tents arranged in orderly rows, latrines that were maintained for basic sanitation, areas where children could play under supervision, and administrative offices where information about separated family members could be reported and sometimes reunited. The civilians were processed through an intake system designed to document who they were, where they had come from, and whether they had any knowledge of family members' whereabouts. They were given clean clothes to replace their filthy, tattered garments, provided with soap and access to water for washing away weeks of accumulated cave dirt and fear sweat, and assigned to living quarters with other families. The entire process, while impersonal and bureaucratic, was conducted with basic respect for their dignity as human beings rather than as conquered enemies. Reiko found herself assigned to a tent with Fumiko and 5 other families, lying on a canvas cot for the first time in weeks. The cot was not soft, the thin mattress providing only minimal cushioning, but compared to sleeping on cave floors or huddled against limestone walls, it felt like impossible luxury. Around her, she could hear the sounds of children playing, a noise that had been absent from their lives for so long it seemed almost surreal. The sound of children's laughter, of games being played, of normalcy trying to reassert itself despite everything, brought tears to her eyes. Guards patrolled the camp perimeter with regularity, but Reiko gradually came to understand that they were there primarily to keep the civilians safe from any soldiers who might have hostile intentions, not to imprison the civilians themselves. The camp had rules and restrictions, certainly, but they were rules designed to maintain order and safety rather than to inflict suffering. The contrast between what she had expected and what she found was so vast that she struggled to process it, her worldview undergoing a fundamental restructuring that would take time to fully absorb. In the following days and weeks, as more civilians were brought in from hiding places scattered across the island's interior and along its coasts, stories began to circulate through the camp. The women from the cave talked about the black soldiers who had saved them, who had shown them kindness when they expected brutality, who had shared their own resources and called for medical help and treated them like human beings worthy of compassion. Their stories spread through the camp like ripples in water, mixing with other accounts of American behavior that contradicted the propaganda narrative in various ways. Some stories were more complicated, acknowledging that not all American soldiers behaved well. There were incidents of theft, of intimidation, of individual soldiers who did commit offenses against civilians despite official orders against such behavior. The camp administrators worked to address these incidents when they were reported, establishing a system for complaints and implementing punishments for soldiers who violated the rules. But the very fact that such incidents occurred reminded the civilians that Americans were as variable in their behavior as any other group of human beings. Yet the overall pattern that emerged was not one of systematic cruelty or deliberate degradation, but rather of a bureaucratic machinery focused on processing, housing, feeding, and eventually repatriating people who had been caught in the grinding gears of industrial conflict. The conditions were basic, the food monotonous but adequate, and the uncertainty about the future was a constant source of anxiety. But there were no mass atrocities, no death camps, no systematic effort to harm or degrade the civilian population. The contrast with what they had been promised by their own government's propaganda could not have been more stark. Sergeant Washington continued to work with civilian populations as the conflict on Saipan wound down over the following weeks, and the American forces consolidated control of the island. He became a familiar figure in and around the internment camp, known among the Japanese civilians simply as the Good Sergeant, a man who could be approached with problems or questions, who would listen to concerns and do his best to address them, who treated everyone with basic human respect regardless of their nationality, their language, or his own exhaustion from long hours of duty. He wrote letters home to his wife, Martha, in Georgia, trying to explain what he was seeing and experiencing in ways that would help her understand the complexity of his situation. The letters were subject to military censorship, so he had to be careful about what details he included, but he did his best to convey the emotional truth of his experiences. "My dearest Martha," he wrote in one letter that made it past the censors with only minor redactions, "I thought I understood prejudice. I thought I knew what it was to be judged by what I am rather than who I am, to be seen as less than human because of something as arbitrary as skin color. But these people here on this island were taught that we Americans were not even human at all. That capture was worse than death itself, that choosing to end their own lives was preferable to falling into our hands. And now I watch them discover day by day that we are just men, some good and some bad like any group of people, but mostly just trying to do our jobs as best we can and get home safely to the people we love," he continued, his handwriting becoming less neat as emotion influenced his pen. "It makes me think about all the lies we tell ourselves about each other, all the ways we make enemies out of people who are really just scared and confused and trying to survive like us. These women and children I helped pull out of that cave, they are not so different from our own mothers and sisters and children back home. They love their families, they fear for their futures. They want safety and food and a chance to live in peace. The propaganda tried to convince them that we were devils, and our own propaganda tried to convince us that they were fanatics who would never surrender. Both lies, Martha. Both cruel lies that cost lives unnecessarily." He finished the letter with words that revealed his deep understanding of the moral complexities of the conflict. "I do not know if what we are doing here is right in some larger sense. I do not know if this conflict will make the world better or simply different, but I do know that treating people with basic human dignity is always right, regardless of what governments or militaries or propaganda says. I hold on to that truth, and I hope it helps me stay the man you married, rather than becoming someone hardened by all this suffering and death." Corporal Marcus Thompson, who had studied sociology at a historically black college before the conflict interrupted his education, found himself fascinated by the psychological transformation he witnessed among the civilian population. He started keeping detailed notes in a journal he carried, making observations about how quickly people could adjust their worldview when faced with contradictory evidence, how propaganda's power came from isolation and could be broken by simple human contact and lived experience. "The women ask us questions constantly," he wrote in an entry dated late July 1944. "They want to know about America, about our lives there, about how we are treated, about whether we have families and homes and normal lives. When they learn that we face discrimination in our own country, that we are not fully equal citizens under our own laws, they are confused and troubled. Why do you fight?" they ask through translators, "for a nation that treats you this way? Why do you risk your lives for a country that does not grant you full rights?" He continued, working through his own thoughts on paper. "And I tell them what I believe to be true, which is that I fight because I believe America can be better than it currently is. Because fighting for freedom abroad might help bring freedom at home, might demonstrate to those who doubt us that we are fully capable and fully deserving of equal treatment. Because sometimes you have to do the right thing, even when the right thing is hard, and the reward is uncertain, and the people you are helping might not appreciate it, or even acknowledge it." Thompson's notes also documented the varying reactions among the Japanese civilians as they processed their experiences. Some adapted quickly, eager to cooperate and grateful for the basic humanity they were shown. Others remained suspicious and withdrawn, unable or unwilling to let go of the propaganda they had internalized over years. Still others fell into a kind of emotional numbness, traumatized by the loss of homes and family members and the shattering of their entire worldview. Thompson tried to understand all these reactions without judgment, seeing them as natural responses to extraordinary circumstances. Private David Johnson, the jazz musician from Harlem who had brought music and culture to smoky clubs before the conflict claimed him, started teaching some of the children simple songs in English, using music as a bridge across the chasms of language and culture. He would sit outside the camp's communal areas during his off-duty hours with a harmonica he had carried through the entire campaign, protected in a waterproof pouch and treasured as his connection to the life he had left behind. He played tunes that made children smile and adults pause in their tasks to listen, melodies that needed no translation because music speaks to something universal in human experience. Some of the Japanese women knew traditional songs from their own culture, and gradually a kind of exchange began, with Johnson learning Japanese melodies and the women learning American ones, creating moments of genuine cultural connection in the midst of occupation and displacement. One afternoon, Johnson sat playing a slow, melancholy blues number that captured some of his own feelings about the conflict and his place in it. An elderly Japanese woman approached, one who had lost her entire family in the fighting, and began to sing along in Japanese, her words different, but her emotional expression perfectly matching the mood of his music. When they finished, both had tears on their faces, and Johnson understood that grief and loss transcended all boundaries of nationality and language. In late July, several weeks after the dramatic rescue from the cave, Reiko was called to the camp administrative office by a runner who knocked on her tent pole and delivered the summons in halting Japanese. She went with immediate trepidation, uncertain what this official summons might mean, her mind racing through possibilities both hopeful and terrifying. Perhaps there was news of Hiroshi. Perhaps there was some problem with her documentation. Perhaps she was being selected for repatriation, though that seemed too soon given the continuing conflict. Inside the administrative building, which was really just a larger tent with desks and filing cabinets, she found a Red Cross worker, an American woman named Helen Morrison, who spoke Japanese with surprising fluency and accuracy. Morrison was perhaps 40 years old, with kind eyes behind practical glasses and an air of professional competence mixed with genuine compassion. "Mrs. Tanaka," Morrison said gently in Japanese, gesturing for Reiko to sit in the chair across from her desk. "I have some information about your husband. I wanted to deliver this news personally rather than simply posting it on the notification board." Reiko's heart clenched painfully in her chest. She had been trying desperately not to think too much about Hiroshi, trying to focus on keeping Fumiko safe and healthy, trying to survive each day as it came, rather than dwelling on fears about what might have happened to her husband. But now, faced with the certainty of news, all her suppressed anxiety and dread rushed to the surface in a wave that left her breathless. He was among the civilian workers who were stationed at the sugar refinery when the fighting began, Morrison continued in a quiet, respectful tone. When it became clear that the island's defense was failing, many of the civilians there were given weapons and ordered to fight as auxiliary soldiers. Your husband Hiroshi was one of them. I am very sorry to tell you that he did not survive the final days of the conflict. The words seemed to come from very far away, as though Morrison was speaking to her through water or from the other end of a long tunnel. Reiko felt Fumiko's small hand slip into hers, felt her daughter's presence beside her providing an anchor to reality, and somehow that physical connection kept her from floating away entirely into grief and shock. "How?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did he die? Where?" Morrison consulted papers on her desk before responding. He was with a group that attempted to break through American lines near the refinery on the morning of July 7th. Many of them were simply trying to reach their families, to find wives and children they had been separated from, but they had been given weapons and were therefore perceived as combatants by the soldiers they encountered. There was an exchange of fire. It was quick, Mrs. Tanaka. According to the report I have, he would not have suffered for long. Reiko bowed her head, tears finally coming in waves that she had been holding back for weeks. Hiroshi had died believing the lies, believing that he was protecting her and Fumiko from monsters, never knowing that the reality was so different from what they had been told. He had died fighting in a conflict he had not chosen, for a cause he had not questioned, defending an island that could not be defended. And she would never be able to tell him that everything he had feared about the enemy was wrong, that the Americans who had captured her had shown her more kindness than her own military had shown him in forcing him to fight. Morrison sat quietly, allowing Reiko time to process her grief, not rushing her or trying to minimize her loss with platitudes. After several long minutes, when the worst of the initial wave of sorrow had passed, Morrison spoke again. "I know this is almost no comfort at all, Mrs. Tanaka, but I want you to know that the soldiers who found you in that cave, Sergeant Washington and his squad, they volunteered specifically for civilian protection duty. They did not have to do that work. They were offered other assignments that would have been easier and less emotionally complicated. They chose this duty because they wanted to help, because they believed it was the right thing to do. The kindness they showed you was not accidental or random. It was deliberate, chosen, intentional. I thought you might want to know that." Reiko looked up at Morrison through her tears, processing this additional information. The Americans who had saved her had chosen to do so, had volunteered for the difficult work of dealing with traumatized civilians and breaking through the barriers of propaganda and fear. That choice, made freely when easier paths were available, meant something significant about their character and values. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "It does help in a small way. It helps to know that there is still goodness in the world, even in the midst of all this terrible loss and destruction." Morrison explained what would happen next. The civilians would be held in the camp until the conflict ended completely throughout the Pacific. Then they would be repatriated to Japan through a systematic process that would take time to organize and implement. Widows and their children would receive some support and priority in the repatriation process, though conditions in Japan itself were deteriorating rapidly as American forces pressed closer to the home islands. Life would not be easy, Morrison warned her honestly, but they would survive if they were strong and resourceful. Reiko carried the news of Hiroshi's death back to her tent, where other women gathered around to offer comfort according to their traditions and limited means. In the days that followed, she found herself watching the black soldiers who rotated through guard duty at the camp, thinking about what Washington had told Grandmother Sato, about his own experiences with prejudice, and his choice to do what was right anyway. She thought about the complexity of men who were denied full equality in their own country, yet who chose to extend compassion and dignity to enemy civilians, about the moral strength required to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. In September 1944, the camp received an unusual visitor, who caused quite a stir among both the civilian detainees and the American military personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Jameson, an African-American officer who served in a liaison capacity with the military government being established on Saipan, came to inspect the civilian facilities. His visit was partly official inspection, ensuring that the camp was being run according to regulations, and partly personal curiosity about the reports he had been hearing regarding Sergeant Washington's squad and their remarkable interactions with Japanese civilians. Jameson was 41 years old, a career military man who had spent 20 grueling years navigating the treacherous complexities of being a black officer in a military establishment thoroughly dominated by white leadership and white assumptions about black capabilities. He had graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1925, one of only a handful of black cadets to do so in that era, and had endured 4 years of systematic isolation and discrimination throughout his time at that prestigious institution. His classmates had refused to room with him, had excluded him from social activities, had made clear in countless small ways that they did not consider him their equal, despite the military academy's supposed commitment to meritocracy. His posting to the Pacific Theater was itself a careful political calculation by military leadership, placing him where his undeniable talents and experience could be useful without threatening the racial status quo of more prominent or politically sensitive commands. He had become adept at working within a system designed to limit him, finding ways to be effective while navigating the minefield of prejudice and institutional racism that permeated every level of military organization. Through translators, Jameson spoke with several of the women from the cave incident, wanting to hear their stories firsthand and understand their perspectives on what had happened and how they were being treated now. What he heard confirmed and elaborated on what he had read in the reports, stories of people whose most fundamental assumptions had been shattered by simple human decency, shown by men who had every reason to be bitter about their own treatment in American society. "I would like to tell you something," Jameson said to an assembled group of about 20 women who had gathered at the request of camp administrators to meet with this high-ranking officer. "And I ask the translators to convey my words as accurately as possible, because what I am about to say is important for understanding." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued with the kind of honesty that was rare in official communications. "In my country, there is a great struggle happening even as this conflict continues across the Pacific. People who look like me, people whose ancestors were brought to America in chains as slaves, people whose grandparents and in some cases parents lived under the legal bondage of one human being owning another, are fighting for equal rights, for dignity, for recognition as full human beings deserving of the same opportunities and protections as any other American citizens." The translator conveyed his words carefully, and the assembled women listened with rapt attention, many of them hearing for the first time about the internal contradictions and conflicts within American society. Jameson continued, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "We have served our country in every conflict since its founding, from the revolution that created America, through every subsequent engagement. We served in the conflict against my own alma mater's namesake, fighting to preserve the Union, even though that Union had not granted us freedom or equality. We served in the Great War, proving our courage and capability on European battlefields. And we serve now in this conflict against your nation's military forces, demonstrating once again that we are as brave, as capable, as dedicated as any soldiers anywhere." He let that sink in before adding, "And yet, despite all this service, despite all this proof of our worth and capability, we are still treated as lesser citizens in many parts of our own country. There are laws that say where we can live, where we can eat, what schools our children can attend, what jobs we can hold.